Do you believe you have true friends? People who genuinely care about you, without hidden motives? Carl Jung, a revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist, made a discovery that could shake everything you think about human relationships. He unveiled a dark truth. Behind every seemingly sincere smile lies a far more complex and unsettling psychological reality. Jung revealed that we all carry hidden aspects of our personality, impulses, desires, and motivations we don't even recognize in ourselves. He discovered that we constantly wear social masks, which he called personas, and that true human intimacy is nearly impossible when we don't fully know our own shadow aspects. How many times have you been betrayed by someone you blindly trusted? How many times have you discovered that a special person had selfish motives? It wasn't by chance. Jung described the psychological mechanisms that make true friendship extraordinarily rare. Prepare for a disturbing revelation about human nature that could forever change how you perceive your relationships. 1. The persona, the mask we all wear. Imagine this scenario. Every morning, when you wake up, before leaving your home, you put on an invisible mask. This mask isn't made of plastic or fabric. It's crafted from expectations, social norms, and a desperate need to be accepted. Carl Jung called this psychological disguise the persona, and he discovered something chilling. Most people never take off this mask, even when they're alone. Jung drew the term persona from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. But unlike theatrical masks, which actors remove after the performance, our psychological personas become so deeply ingrained that we forget we're wearing them. We become the mask, and the mask becomes us. This is where the illusion of friendship begins to crumble. Think about your closest relationships. How much of what you show these people is authentically you? And how much is a carefully curated version designed to maintain their approval? Jung observed that we construct different personas for different social contexts. A professional mask at work, a loving mask with family, a fun mask with friends. But here's the shocking reality. If you're always wearing a mask, how can anyone truly know you? And if they don't know you, how can they truly be your friend? The persona serves a crucial evolutionary function. It helps us navigate complex social hierarchies, avoid conflict, and maintain group cohesion. However, Jung warned that when the persona becomes too rigid or dominant, it creates what he called persona inflation, a state where we identify so strongly with our social mask that we lose touch with our authentic self. This is when relationships become transactional rather than authentic. Think of a colleague who always seems cheerful and helpful at work. They laugh at every joke, volunteer for extra projects, and seem genuinely interested in everyone's weekend plans. But Jung would ask, what's hiding behind that constant friendliness? What aspects of their personality are they suppressing to maintain this pleasing facade? The answer is often uncomfortable. Irritation, judgment, jealousy, or simply the exhaustion of constantly performing. The most unsettling aspect of the persona is how unconscious it becomes. We don't deliberately choose to put on a mask every morning. We slip into the role automatically. A mother might suppress her frustration to appear nurturing. A leader might hide their insecurity to project confidence. A friend might mask their rivalry to seem supportive. These aren't necessarily acts of deception. Often, people genuinely believe they're being authentic, while unconsciously filtering their expression through their persona. Jung observed that the persona creates a fundamental barrier to intimacy. When two personas interact, there's no real connection, just a dance of social expectations. True friendship requires what Jung called an authentic encounter, where people take the risk of showing their unmasked selves. But this rarely happens because removing the persona feels dangerous. Without protective masks, we fear rejection, judgment, or abandonment. The tragedy of relationships based on personas is their superficiality disguised as depth. People can spend decades together as friends, partners, or family members without ever truly knowing each other beyond their social masks. They interact with personas, not authentic selves, creating an illusion of closeness while maintaining emotional distance. Jung discovered that the persona also serves as a defense mechanism against our own shadow aspects, those parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. By constructing a persona that embodies our idealized self, we can reject traits that make us uncomfortable. The always positive person doesn't have to face their cynicism. The always strong person can avoid their vulnerability. The always generous friend can ignore their selfishness. This psychological mechanism has profound implications for friendship. If someone can't acknowledge their own dark aspects, how can they truly accept those traits in others? Jung argued that authentic relationships require integrating both the light and dark aspects of the personality. But most people are so invested in maintaining their persona that they unconsciously expect others to do the same. The persona also creates what Jung called mutual deception in relationships. Both parties present idealized versions of themselves while secretly expecting the other to maintain their mask as well. When an authentic self begins to emerge, perhaps by expressing anger, vulnerability, or selfishness, it can threaten the entire relationship dynamic because it challenges the unspoken agreement to keep personas intact. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how addictive the persona can become. The social approval we receive for our masked behavior reinforces the pattern, making it increasingly difficult to risk authentic expression. We become dependent on the approval we receive for our performances, even though that approval isn't truly for us. It's for our carefully crafted image. Jung warned that living primarily through the persona leads to what he called a spiritual void, a sense of disconnection from our authentic self and others. The constant performance becomes exhausting, but we can't imagine living without it. This is why so many people report feeling lonely even when surrounded by friends. They're surrounded by people interacting with other personas, creating the appearance of connection without its substance. The implications are profound. If we all wear masks and only know the masks of others, true friendship becomes nearly impossible. We don't form friendships with people. We form friendships with their performances. And they aren't our friends. They're friends with our performance. Understanding the persona doesn't mean we should abandon all social courtesy or appropriate behavior. Jung advocated for what he called conscious use of the persona, being aware of when we're using social masks and making deliberate choices about when and how to do so. The goal isn't to eliminate the persona, but to avoid being consumed by it, maintaining a connection with our authentic self while navigating social reality. This awareness becomes the first step toward authentic relationships, recognizing that we and others are far more complex than the masks we present, and that true intimacy requires the courage to let those masks slip occasionally, revealing the messy, complicated, but ultimately more authentic human beneath. 2. The shadow, the face. We deny. Every human being carries a dark passenger, an unseen collection of traits, impulses, and desires they refuse to acknowledge. Carl Jung called this psychological phenomenon the shadow, and his research revealed a troubling truth. The traits we most fiercely deny in ourselves are often the ones secretly directing our behavior. Even more shocking, these shadow aspects directly sabotage our ability to form genuine friendships, as we cannot truly connect with others when we're actively fleeing parts of ourselves. Jung discovered the shadow through years of clinical observation and his own painful self-analysis. He noticed that his patients consistently projected their repressed traits onto others, seeing in their friends and enemies the very traits they couldn't bear to acknowledge in themselves. A person who prides themselves on honesty might be unconsciously manipulative. A person who seems endlessly generous might harbor deep resentment for always giving. A friend who appears eternally positive might be suppressing an ocean of rage, The shadow isn't limited to negative traits. It encompasses everything that doesn't fit our idealized self-image, including positive traits we've learned to suppress, negative emotions we've learned to hide, and natural impulses we've been conditioned to deny. A person raised to always be selfless might repress healthy self-interest. Someone taught to be constantly strong might reject their need for comfort and support. What makes the shadow particularly insidious in relationships is how it operates unconsciously. We don't consciously choose to repress these aspects of ourselves. The repression happens automatically, like a protective mechanism. However, Jung warned that what we don't claim within ourselves, we inevitably project onto others, leading to fundamental distortions in how we perceive and interact with people. Think of a friend who constantly criticizes others for being fake or attention-seeking. Jung would suggest examining whether this person might be denying their own need for validation or performative behaviors. A person who irrationally bristles at selfish people might be grappling with their own repressed selfishness. We are most triggered by the traits in others that we refuse to admit in ourselves. This projection mechanism destroys authentic friendship because we don't see others clearly. We see them through the distorted lens of our own psychological projections. We might be drawn to someone because they express traits we've hidden in ourselves, creating an unconscious attraction. Conversely, we might feel an inexplicable aversion to someone who mirrors our repressed traits, perceiving them as threatening or repulsive. Jung observed that the shadow often emerges during moments of stress, fatigue, or emotional intensity, when our conscious control weakens. A perpetually kind person might suddenly explode with unexpected cruelty. A consistently responsible person might act with shocking recklessness. A friend who never shows vulnerability might break down with dramatic emotional intensity. These aren't aberrations, but glimpses of the shadow piercing through our conscious defenses. The shadow also manifests in our dreams, fantasies, and the traits we secretly admire or despise in others. Jung encouraged people to pay attention to their strongest emotional reactions toward others, as they often point directly to shadow material. The celebrities we're obsessed with, the people we irrationally hate, the traits we find most attractive or repulsive, all provide clues to what we've repressed in ourselves. In friendship, the shadow creates what Jung called unconscious contracts. We unconsciously seek relationships that allow us to maintain our self-image while vicariously living out our shadow through others. A wise friend might unconsciously encourage their rebellious friend to act out, vicariously expressing traits they've repressed in themselves. A rational person might be drawn to highly emotional friends, living their feelings through them while maintaining their identity as a logical, controlled person. This shadow dynamic creates unstable and ultimately inauthentic relationships. When we use friends to express our repressed traits, we don't truly see or accept them as individuals. We use them as psychological repositories for the parts of ourselves we can't integrate, creating a form of emotional parasitism disguised as friendship. Jung discovered that the shadow contains not only negative traits, but also positive ones we've learned to repress. A person raised in a family that valued modesty might repress natural confidence and charisma. Someone taught that intelligence is threatening might deny their intellectual abilities. These golden shadow aspects represent untapped potential, but their denial creates an inner sense of emptiness and inadequacy that affects all relationships. The shadow also encompasses what Jung called the primitive aspects of human nature, the fundamental drives for power, sexuality, aggression, and survival that civilized society teaches us to suppress. But denying these core aspects of human nature doesn't eliminate them. It pushes them into the shadow, where they influence behavior in unconscious and often destructive ways. A person who denies their aggressive impulses might express them through passive aggressiveness, or unconsciously choose relationships with aggressive partners. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how the shadow affects our capacity for true intimacy. Genuine closeness requires what Jung called shadow integration, the ability to recognize and accept the full complexity of ourselves as human beings. But most people are so invested in maintaining their idealized self-image that they can't risk the vulnerability required for authentic connection. They present only their acceptable traits, desperately trying to hide or deny everything else. This creates relationships built on mutual deception and self-deception. We show others only the parts of ourselves we deem lovable, while secretly fearing that if they saw our darker aspects, they'd reject us. At the same time, we often fail to truly accept others because we unconsciously expect them to maintain the same level of self-deception we uphold toward ourselves. Jung argued that working with the shadow, the process of recognizing, accepting, and integrating our repressed traits, is essential for psychological health and authentic relationships. This doesn't mean acting on every impulse or abandoning moral principles, but developing conscious awareness of our full complexity and learning to interact with others from that space of total integration, rather than from a fragmented perspective of repressed aspects. The shadow also reveals why so many friendships don't survive major life changes or crises. When external pressure increases, our shadow aspects are more likely to emerge, challenging the carefully maintained images we presented to our friends. A friend who seemed endlessly supportive might reveal their capacity for judgment when we face struggles. A person who seems strong and stable might become needy and demanding during their own difficulties. These aren't betrayals, but revelations of the human complexity that was always present but hidden. Understanding the shadow explains why true friendship is so rare and difficult. It requires courage to face one's own repressed traits and maturity to accept the full complexity of others. Most people lack either the self-awareness to recognize their shadow or the emotional resilience to maintain relationships with people who occasionally reveal their less idealized aspects. Jung's exploration of the shadow reveals a fundamental challenge in human relationships. How can we truly know and accept others if we don't know and accept ourselves? The shadow represents everything we've decided is unacceptable in a human being. But until we reclaim those repressed parts of ourselves, our relationships will remain superficial performances rather than authentic encounters between whole human beings. 3. The collective unconscious. Why we act like everyone else. Here's a troubling observation uncovered by Carl Jung. Do you think your thoughts belong to you? They don't. Your desires, fears, reactions, and even your deepest beliefs are largely programmed by invisible psychological forces Jung called the collective unconscious. This discovery shattered the illusion of individual autonomy and revealed why authentic friendship is nearly impossible. We don't truly connect with unique individuals, but with walking collections of shared psychological patterns disguised as personality. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious emerged from his observation that certain symbols, myths, and behavioral patterns appear across all cultures and throughout history, despite no direct cultural transmission. He realized that beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of shared psychological content that influences every human being. This isn't learned behavior. It's an inherited psychological structure, like having brown eyes or being right-handed. The collective unconscious operates through what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that shape how we perceive, feel, and act. These archetypes include the mother, the hero, the trickster, the sage, the shadow, and dozens of others. What makes this discovery so unsettling is that when these archetypes activate in our psyche, we lose individual agency and begin acting out ancient psychological scripts. Think about your closest friendships. How much of your interactions follow predictable patterns? The friend who always plays the savior, the one who constantly needs saving, the person who serves as the group's entertainer, the one who takes on the role of wise counselor. These aren't unique personality traits. They're archetypal roles that people unconsciously adopt. And Jung discovered that we often choose our friends based on how they complement our own archetypal patterns, rather than appreciating them as unique individuals. The collective unconscious explains why groups of friends often develop similar dynamics, regardless of the specific individuals involved. There's usually someone who becomes the scapegoat, someone who emerges as the leader, someone who plays the mediator, and someone who serves as the rebel. These roles aren't consciously assigned. They emerge automatically as the collective unconscious organizes group behavior according to ancient patterns. Jung observed that the collective unconscious becomes particularly active during times of stress, uncertainty, or transition. When people feel threatened or disoriented, they fall back on archetypal patterns that feel familiar and safe. This is why crises often reveal the superficiality of many friendships. People abandon their individual responses and revert to collective patterns that may not align with their personal relationships. Consider how people behave during social movements, political upheavals, or cultural shifts. Jung noticed that individuals who seemed unique and independent suddenly begin to think, feel, and act in strikingly similar ways. Their language becomes identical, their emotional reactions mirror each other, and their behaviors follow predictable patterns. They believe they're expressing their authentic selves, but in reality, they're possessed by collective psychological forces. This archetypal possession creates what Jung called psychological inflation, a state where people lose touch with their individual identity and identify with collective patterns. A person absorbed in a political movement might lose their ability to think nuancedly, seeing the world only through the archetypal lens of good versus evil. A person obsessed with a romantic relationship might be possessed by the archetypal pattern of the lover, losing their independent judgment and personal boundaries. In friendships, archetypal possession manifests when people unconsciously place themselves in predefined roles. A person who's always seeking advice isn't necessarily seeking wisdom. They're unconsciously activating the archetypal pattern of the eternal child, seeking a parental figure. A friend who's always giving advice isn't necessarily wise. They're possessed by the archetypal role of the sage or magical helper. These patterns feel natural and satisfying because they tap into deep psychological structures, but they prevent authentic relationships. Jung discovered that the collective unconscious also contains what he called cultural complexes, shared psychological patterns specific to certain groups, nations, or historical periods. Americans carry certain collective psychological patterns that differ from those of Europeans or Asians. Each generation develops its own collective complexes that influence behavior in predictable ways. These cultural patterns become so deeply ingrained that people mistake them for individual personality traits. The collective unconscious explains why friendship is often more about unconscious conformity than genuine connection. People are drawn to others who share similar archetypal patterns or complement their own psychological roles. But this attraction isn't based on appreciating the other person's unique qualities. It's based on how they fit into predefined psychological models. This creates relationships that feel meaningful but lack authentic depth. Friends can spend years together without ever truly seeing each other as individuals because they interact through the lens of collective patterns. The supportive friend, the fun friend, the reliable friend. These aren't descriptions of unique human beings, but archetypal roles that people unconsciously adopt and maintain. Jung observed that the collective unconscious becomes particularly problematic when it remains entirely unconscious. When people don't recognize these universal patterns operating within them, they become puppets of psychological forces beyond their awareness. They believe they're making individual choices, but in reality, they're following ancient scripts that have shaped human behavior for millennia. The collective unconscious also explains why peer pressure is so powerful and why people often abandon their values to fit into a group. The need for belonging taps into archetypal patterns of tribal survival, which override individual consciousness. People betray their own principles, even their closest friends, to maintain their position in the collective. Not because they're weak or immoral, but because they're overwhelmed by unconscious psychological forces. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is how the collective unconscious influences what we find attractive or desirable in relationships. Our preferences for certain personality types, physical traits, or behavioral patterns are largely determined by archetypal models, not individual choice. We think we choose friends based on personal compatibility, but we often choose people who fit psychological patterns activated by the collective unconscious. This explains why many friendships follow predictable trajectories, regardless of the specific individuals involved. Initial attraction, a honeymoon phase, the emergence of conflict, disappointment, or eventual dissolution. These patterns repeat because they're not based on individual relationships, but on archetypal dynamics played out through human personalities. Jung argued that becoming aware of the collective unconscious is essential for developing authentic relationships. This doesn't mean rejecting these universal patterns. They're part of human nature and serve important psychological functions. It means recognizing when we're being influenced by collective forces and making conscious choices about how to respond. The collective unconscious also reveals why authentic individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, is so rare and difficult. Most people never develop beyond the collective patterns they've inherited from their culture, family, and historical moment. They mistake conformity to these patterns for authenticity, never realizing that their so-called unique personality is largely a collection of shared psychological models. Understanding the collective unconscious changes how we perceive friendship and relationships. It reveals that most of what we consider personal connection is actually an interaction of impersonal psychological forces. True friendship requires the courage to look beyond these collective patterns and connect with the unique individual beneath the archetypal masks. This awareness explains why authentic relationships feel so rare and precious. They require two people to develop enough consciousness to recognize and transcend the collective patterns that typically govern human interactions. 4. Projection. How we blame others for our own flaws. Carl Jung made one of the most uncomfortable discoveries about human psychology. We don't see people as they truly are. We see them contaminated by our own unresolved psychological material. This mechanism, which he called projection, reveals why true friendship is nearly impossible. We constantly project our repressed traits, unmet needs, and unhealed wounds onto others, then react to those projections as if they were reality. In essence, we form relationships with distorted versions of people that exist primarily in our own minds. Projection works like a psychological movie projector, casting the contents of our unconscious onto the screen of another person's personality. Just as a film projector displays images that aren't actually part of the screen, we attribute traits, motivations, and characteristics to others that exist primarily in our own psyche. The most unsettling aspect is that we're usually completely unaware of this process. We sincerely believe we're seeing others clearly when, in reality, we're seeing our own psychological reflections. Jung discovered that projection serves a protective function for the ego. Instead of facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves, we unconsciously locate those traits in others. A person struggling with dishonesty becomes hypersensitive to detecting lies in others. A person grappling with their own selfishness constantly accuses their friends of being self-centered. A person repressing manipulative tendencies sees manipulation everywhere around them. This psychological mechanism creates what Jung called projected relationships. connections based more on our internal psychological dynamics than on the actual characteristics of the other person. We form friendships with people who seem to embody what we need to heal or integrate within ourselves. But we remain unaware of this psychological attraction. The attraction feels natural and inevitable, but it's actually driven by unresolved internal tensions seeking external resolution. Think of a friend who constantly irritates you with their neediness. Jung would ask what this might trigger about your own repressed needs for dependence. Perhaps you've learned to suppress your own need for support and attention, so when someone else openly expresses those traits, it threatens your psychological defenses. Your irritation isn't really about their behavior. It's about your own internal conflict with those natural human needs. Projection becomes particularly complex in close relationships because it often contains both positive and negative elements. We might project our own untapped potential onto our friends, perceiving them as more talented, attractive, or capable than they actually are. This creates unrealistic expectations and inevitable disappointment when they fail to live up to our projected idealization. Conversely, we might project our feared flaws onto them, constantly finding fault and criticism where it's not warranted. Jung observed that the intensity of our emotional reactions to others often indicates the presence of projections. When someone's behavior triggers disproportionate anger, attraction, disgust, or fascination, it's likely we're encountering our own projected material. A friend who always needs to be right might carry our own projected intellectual insecurity. A person we view as impossibly perfect might possess our own repressed positive traits. The projection mechanism explains why so many friendships follow predictable patterns of idealization, followed by disappointment. In the initial phase, we project our positive needs and unlived potential onto the other person, creating an exaggerated sense of their wonderful qualities. They seem to possess exactly what we've been searching for: understanding, excitement, stability, or adventure. But because these projections aren't based on their actual characteristics, reality eventually seeps in. When the projective bubble bursts, we often swing to the opposite extreme, projecting our negative traits onto the same person. The friend who seemed perfectly understanding becomes impossibly selfish. The person who seemed exciting and spontaneous now seems irresponsible and chaotic. We haven't discovered new information about them. We've simply shifted from a positive projection to a negative one, all while remaining unaware of our own psychological process. Jung discovered that projection creates what he called an unconscious participation mystique, a psychological fusion where we lose the ability to distinguish ourselves from others. We become emotionally entangled with our friends, feeling responsible for their emotions, taking their problems personally, or expecting them to meet our unmet psychological needs. This isn't intimacy. It's a psychological entanglement based on unresolved internal dynamics. The projection mechanism also explains why we often choose friends who seem to complement our conscious personality, when, in reality, they reflect our unconscious conflicts. A person who identifies as rational might be drawn to highly emotional friends, not because opposites attract, but because they're unconsciously seeking to connect with their own repressed emotional nature through the relationship. They project their repressed emotional function onto their friend, then idealize them for their emotional capacity, or criticize them for being too sensitive. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how projection prevents us from truly helping or supporting our friends. When we see them through the lens of our own projected material, we're unable to accurately assess their real needs or struggles. We might give advice that addresses our own internal conflicts rather than their actual situation. We might try to fix problems in them that exist primarily in our own psyche. We might become frustrated when they don't respond to our help as we expect, without realizing that we're addressing our own issues, not theirs. Jung observed that projection often intensifies during times of personal stress or transition. When our own psychological balance is threatened, We unconsciously seek external targets for our internal confusion. A friend going through a difficult divorce might suddenly see betrayal and dishonesty everywhere. A person facing career insecurity might become overly critical of others' professional choices. Someone confronting their own mortality might become obsessed with others' health and lifestyle decisions. Projection also operates collectively, creating shared projections within groups of friends. A group might unconsciously designate one member to carry certain projected traits: the rebel, the responsible one, the victim, or the troublemaker. These roles become rigid and limiting, preventing individuals from expressing their full complexity while serving the group's unconscious need to organize and contain threatening psychological material. The projection mechanism shows why authentic empathy is so rare. Genuine empathy requires the ability to feel another person's actual emotional experiences without contaminating them with our own projected material. But most of what we interpret as empathy is actually projection-based sympathy. We recognize in others emotions we've experienced ourselves, then assume they're feeling what we would feel in similar circumstances. Jung argued that recognizing and withdrawing projections is essential for psychological development and authentic relationships. This process requires developing what he called active imagination, the ability to hold psychological tension within ourselves rather than unconsciously projecting it onto others. It means taking responsibility for our own emotional reactions and examining what they might reveal about our inner state, rather than immediately assuming they're caused by others' behavior. Withdrawing projections is often experienced as a loss or disappointment, because we must let go of the fantasy relationships we've created to see people as they truly are. The friend we idealize turns out to be an ordinary human being. The person we demonized shows unexpected depth and complexity. This process can feel destabilizing because it forces us to reclaim the psychological energy we invested in projected relationships and use it for our own inner growth. Perhaps the most challenging aspect is recognizing positive projections, the ways we attribute our own untapped potential to others, while remaining disconnected from those qualities in ourselves. We might admire a friend's confidence but fail to develop our own. We might be fascinated by someone's creativity while neglecting our own artistic impulses. These positive projections rob us of our own development while creating unrealistic expectations of others. Jung discovered that projection serves as a bridge between the unconscious and conscious mind. What we project onto others often represents aspects of ourselves trying to become conscious. A friend who irritates us with their stubbornness might show us our own capacity for determination. A person we admire for their independence might reflect our own need for autonomy. Projection becomes a diagnostic tool for understanding our own psychological development. Understanding projection changes how we interpret difficulties in relationships. Instead of immediately blaming others for problems or conflicts, we can ask what the situation might reveal about our own inner dynamics. This doesn't mean taking responsibility for others' behavior or denying real issues, but recognizing that our perception of others is always filtered through our own psychological lens. Recognizing projection as a universal human mechanism explains why Jung was so pessimistic about the possibility of truly knowing others. If we're constantly looking at people through the distorted lens of our own projected material, how can we ever meet them as they truly are? This sobering realization explains why authentic friendship requires not just good intentions, but ongoing psychological work to recognize and integrate our own projected material before we can hope to see others clearly. And here's the haunting question Jung leaves us with. If you've spent your entire life looking at others through the prism of your own projections, blaming them for traits that actually live within you, how many authentic relationships have you truly had? And even more troubling, if your friends are doing the same, seeing you not as you are but as a screen for their own psychological material, who truly sees you? Jung's discovery of projection suggests that most of us go through life surrounded by people but fundamentally alone, trapped in a world of psychological mirrors where authentic human connection remains an elusive dream.